Imagine an army of 500,000 men moving across a continent, eating together, sleeping together, fighting together, and almost never losing. Not because they had better weapons, not because they were bigger or stronger, but because of something so small, so mundane, that most historians barely mention it. 8 men, 1 tent, every single night. That's it. That's the secret. But here's what makes it strange. Their enemies? Brave warriors, fierce fighters, men who had been killing since childhood. And they slept alone or in loose groups, with no system, no structure, no logic to how they rested. And it destroyed them. Every time. So why did 8 Roman soldiers share a tent? And why did that tiny detail help build the greatest military empire the world has ever seen? The answer goes deeper than you think. And by the end of this video, you'll never look at teamwork, discipline, or even sleep the same way again. Let's set the scene. It's 58 BC, Gaul, what we now call France. Julius Caesar has just crossed into hostile territory with roughly 6 legions, about 30,000 men. The forests are thick. The tribes are watching. At any moment, 50,000 screaming Gauls could pour out of those tree lanes. Caesar doesn't panic. He gives one order: make camp. And what happens next is almost unbelievable. In under 3 hours, in the middle of enemy territory, 30,000 men have built a fully functional fortified camp. Trenches dug, walls raised, gates posted, firli, and inside, row after row of perfectly ordered tents, each one holding exactly 8 men. The Gauls watching from the trees don't understand what they're seeing. This isn't an army setting up for the night. This is a machine that never stops running. And the tent, that little leather tent, is the engine. The Roman army divided itself into units called contubernia. Say it slowly, contubernia. It means roughly tent group. 8 soldiers, 1 mule, 1 tent, 1 shared cooking pot, 1 shared identity. This was not optional. This was not based on friendship. The Roman military assigned you your contubernium, and those 8 men became your world for the next 20 to 25 years of service. Think about that number. 25 years. That's longer than most modern careers. Longer than some marriages. You didn't choose these men, but you would sleep next to them, eat with them, bleed with them, and probably die near them. Every tent was roughly 3 meters by 3 meters. That's about 10 feet by 10 feet. 8 men, full equipment, a space smaller than most modern bathrooms. No privacy, no silence, no escape, and that was entirely the point. Here's where it gets interesting. The Roman military didn't stumble into this arrangement by accident. They engineered it. The contubernium was the smallest tactical unit in the entire Roman army. Above it came the century, 80 men, 10 tent groups. Above that, the cohort. Above that, the legion. It was a perfect pyramid, and at the base of that pyramid sat 8 men in a leather tent. Every order that came down from the legate at the top had to pass through each layer. But the real enforcement, the real power, happened at the bottom, in the tent. Because if one man in your group of 8 failed, if he lost his equipment, if he fell asleep on guard duty, if he broke formation, everyone in his tent felt it. They could be punished together. They shared rations together. They carried each other's burdens on the march. The Romans had figured out something that modern military psychologists, corporate consultants, and sports coaches spend billions of dollars trying to recreate. Small groups create deep loyalty. Deep loyalty creates performance. Performance wins wars. But the tent didn't just create loyalty. It created something even more powerful. Accountability. Picture this. You're a Roman legionary. You're 19 years old. You've just completed your first brutal day of marching, 20 miles in full armor, carrying a pack that weighs close to 40 kilograms. That's 88 pounds. Your feet are raw. Your shoulders are destroyed. Your neck aches from the weight of your helmet. You collapse into your tent, and there are 7 other men in there with you. They're just as tired, just as broken, but they're watching you, not with hostility, with something more complicated than that. They need you. Tomorrow, on that battlefield, the man to your left and the man to your right are your tent mates. If you are weak, they're exposed. If they are weak, you are dead. So you push yourself. Not for the emperor, not for Rome, not for some abstract ideal of glory. You push yourself because Marcus, sleeping 2 feet to your left, has a wife and a kid back in Cisalpine Gaul, and if you fall apart on that battlefield, he might never see them again. The tent created stakes that were deeply, painfully personal, and that changed everything. But let's talk about what life in that tent actually looked like. Because this is where most history books go quiet, and where the real story lives. The tent was made from the hides of 10 calves, stitched together into a structure the Romans called a papilio, a butterfly, because of the way it spread open when erected. It was not comfortable. It was not warm by modern standards. In the winter campaigns of northern Europe, it was genuinely brutal. But the Romans had a system for that too. Each contubernium traveled with a single mule. That mule carried the tent, the grinding stone, a cooking pot, a hand mill for grain, and other shared equipment. The men carried everything else themselves, their weapons, their personal kit, their entrenching tools, 3 days of rations. When they made camp, the cooking was shared. Each man contributed grain from his personal ration, and the group ground it together and made their bread together. This wasn't just efficiency. This was ritual, breaking bread literally every single night with the same 7 men for years on end. Modern anthropologists have a term for this kind of repeated share experience. They call it synchrony. And synchrony, study after study shows, creates trust faster than almost anything else. The Romans didn't have the word, but they had the system. The daily routine inside a Roman camp was almost violently structured, and the tent group was the unit that executed every part of it. Before dawn, a trumpet sounded across the camp. Every man in every tent was expected to be awake and moving. The tent group struck camp together, pulling stakes, rolling hides, loading the mule. If your group was slow, the sentry noticed. If the sentry was slow, the cohort noticed. There was nowhere to hide. This is a detail that's easy to gloss over, but stop and really feel it. There was nowhere to hide. In a modern army, or a modern office, or a modern school, you can slack off in corners. You can disappear into the crowd. You can be invisible. In a Roman contubernium, there was no invisible. 7 men knew your every move, every morning, every night for 25 years. That kind of sustained, intimate observation does something to a person. It either breaks them, and those men were quickly removed from the legions, or it forges them into something extraordinary. Now let's talk about what happened when things went wrong. Because the Roman system was not kind to failure. If a soldier fell asleep on guard duty, he wasn't just personally punished. The army held the entire tent group responsible. This concept, collective punishment, sounds brutal to modern ears. But it was also brilliantly effective. The Roman system of punishment had a name that still sends a chill down the spine of anyone who knows Roman history. Decimation. If a unit broke and ran in battle, if cowardice was judged to have infected a group, the men were forced to draw lots. Every 10th man was beaten to death by the other 9, including their tent mates. That is not a metaphor. That is not an exaggeration. The Romans made soldiers kill their friends to remind everyone else what failure cost. But here's the thing. Decimation was rare precisely because it was known. The threat hung over every contubernium like a shadow. And because each man knew his cowardice could doom a friend to that fate, cowardice became almost unthinkable. The tent group didn't just create loyalty. It created a cage of social obligation so powerful that individual fear of death became less motivating than the fear of letting down the 7 men beside you. Think about that. They were more afraid of betraying their friends than they were of dying. That's what 8 men in a tent could do. Now compare this to the men the Romans fought. The Gauls were not weak. Julius Caesar describes them with genuine respect. Tall, fierce, skilled with weapons, and individually terrifying. A Gallic warrior in single combat against a Roman legionary was often the Gauls' fight to win. But the Gauls fought as individuals seeking personal glory. A man charged when he felt the moment was right. He fought for his own honor. He struck out to be the one whose name was remembered in the song after the battle. The Germans were similar. Tacitus writes about them in awe. Their courage, their physical power, their savage determination. And yet, Roman legions routinely held against Germanic forces 3 or 4 times their size. The Macedonians before them, the Persians, the Samnites, the Britons, all fierce, all brave, all, in the end, unable to match what the Romans had built. Because bravery without structure is just beautiful chaos. The Roman system turned individual bravery into collective force. 8 men who had eaten together, slept together, trained together, and been punished together moved as one organism on the battlefield. They didn't need to communicate. They didn't need to look at each other. After years of synchrony, they simply knew. Let's zoom out for a moment and look at what the tent system meant across an entire legion. A standard imperial Roman legion contained roughly 5,000 to 6,000 men. That's about 600 to 750 tent groups. Each tent group a small family. Each family linked to 10 others in a century. Each century to 6 others in a cohort. Each cohort to 9 others in the legion. The result was a network of interlocking loyalties that ran from the lowliest recruit all the way up to the eagle standard of the legion. Every man had his primary loyalty to his tent group, his secondary loyalty to his century, his tertiary loyalty to his cohort, and his ultimate loyalty to the legion and to Rome. This layering of loyalty was engineered. It did not happen by accident. Roman military planners understood, perhaps better than any military culture before or since, that men do not die for ideas. They die for each other. And the tent was where that dying for each other was born. There's a human detail here that almost never makes it into the history books, and I want to stop and let it breathe for a moment. Some of these men served together for over 2 decades. They saw each other sick, exhausted, terrified, humiliated. They heard each other cry out in nightmares. They cleaned each other's wounds. They held their tent mate's head while he died from infected sword cut in some nameless field in what is now Romania. These were not just soldiers. They were something closer to a family than most of them had with their blood relatives back home. The Roman army understood this and leaned into it. When a veteran was discharged after 25 years of service, he was given land, often near the men he had served with, so that the contubernium could continue into civilian life. They couldn't let go, even after the fighting was done, and the Romans didn't want them to. A veteran living next to his former tent mates was a stable, loyal community. Roots, history, investment in the local area, less likely to revolt, less likely to drink himself to death in some provincial backwater. The tent group was a social technology. It created soldiers. And then, in retirement, it created citizens. Now, let's bring this all the way back to the beginning. You asked why Roman soldiers slept 8 to a tent while their enemies slept alone. Here is the answer. It was never about the tent. The tent was just a container. What the Romans were building night after night, campaign after campaign, was a human system so resilient and so powerful that it could survive almost anything the ancient world could throw at it. 8 men sharing a 10 by 10 space created synchrony. Synchrony created trust. Trust created accountability. Accountability created performance. And performance, stacked across hundreds of tent groups, across dozens of campaigns, across centuries, created an empire that ruled from Scotland to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. Their enemies were not weak. Their enemies were simply alone. The Roman soldier looked to his left and saw a man who had eaten with him every night for 3 years. He looked to his right and saw the same. Behind him, 7 more men who knew everything about him and depended on him anyway. You cannot break a line held by men who are afraid not of dying, but of letting each other down. You just cannot. And so the legions marched, and the world bent. Here's the question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely want you to think about this before you scroll away. We spend enormous amounts of money on leadership programs, team-building retreats, corporate culture, military training. Billions of dollars trying to manufacture exactly what 8 Roman soldiers built naturally by being forced to share a tent, a mule, a cooking pot, and 25 years of their lives. So here is the question. What if the secret to human performance has never been about the best technology, the best strategy, or the best leader? What if it's always been about the person sleeping 2 feet to your left? The Romans knew the answer 2,000 years ago. Do we? If this made you see something differently today, drop a comment. I read every one of them. And if you want to go deeper into the Roman military machine, the next video breaks down something even more surprising. Why Roman soldiers were actually paid less than you'd expect, and what they did with that money that made them nearly impossible to defeat even off the battlefield. See you there.